I remembered something today. I am a miracle and a blessing, and I think a treasure. Yep, I am. I know what you're thinking. Who does this woman think she is, standing up there proclaiming to be all that and a little more? If I was standing here cradling my son in my arms, you would all be nodding your head in agreement if I said those things about him. Before you took your first word, before you spoke your first word, took your first step, or even could hold your head up by yourself, those amazing accolades were bestowed on you simply because you arrived. You did nothing else. You just arrived. We came as a miracle to behold. With the gifts of wonder and possibility, we are that miracle, that treasure, that blessing. Whole and perfect with our imperfections and accepted for who we are. I think infancy might possibly be the most perfect time of life. We're helpless for all intents and purposes, and yet we get to exercise more control over our environment than we will probably exercise at any other time in our life. Think about it. We get to scream and cry when we have a want or a need. And usually every adult in our vicinity, for at least the first few months, if we're lucky, a year or more, will jump to attend to our needs and desires. And for the most part, we are not held responsible for how anybody else feels. As babies, we get to react to how we feel because we can't yet think or logic ourselves through our world. Although sometimes parents may believe that their young child is manipulating them from an extremely young age, in reality, babies are simply following their instincts, which is to pay attention to their feelings and follow their joy. And their instincts let them know when something is wrong, and they get to let everybody know about it. As adults, we admire those instincts in the animal world. We think to ourselves, isn't that amazing how animals can just sense danger, and yet we're actually born with that same type of guidance system. That's why we cry and fuss, because we're listening to our feelings and we know that something's wrong. Slowly, though, the day comes when we stop listening to those feelings and we start reacting to our environment. We start to think and then adjust our behavior, realizing that when we do things that make our parents and other adults happy, that we get the praise and the recognition that we so crave. We don't even realize that we started to put the responsibility for our joy in someone else's hands. We buy into it when we're told we shouldn't cry. Many of us who are a little bit older have probably been accused at least once in our lives of crocodile tears, as though tears, even from a very young child, are somehow a form of manipulation instead of the source of a genuine emotion. We start becoming afraid to express how we truly feel. We're told, we buy into it when we're told we shouldn't be angry, we shouldn't feel sad. We start to hand over responsibility for how we feel, trying to please everyone around us. That gift of joy that we come here with starts to be a gift that we're expected to give away to make other people happy. Ironically, throughout our lives, we're given gifts that we would never be expected to give away. On your 5th birthday, your parents didn't say to you, now that you've opened all your presents, give them to Sally. If they did, you would probably say, what about me? Which is the question that most of us should be asking ourselves. We do all the time as children, and then we're taught that it's selfish to ask that question. So for a while we still ask the question, but it's just a voice in our head. And then eventually we stop listening to that voice. And that's a problem, because when we stopped listening to that voice is when we started twisting ourselves into knots, trying to figure out how to make everybody else happy. And then we forget that actually trying to please everybody else was a choice that we made, even if we don't consciously remember making that choice. There are very few times in our lives when we actually do stop and analyze choices that we've made. We look back at situations and we'll say to ourselves that we had no other choice when we made a decision, because we forget that we are a miracle, that we came here with powers and gifts and free will. We scramble up our emotions and we lose our guidance system, because our emotions are our guidance system, trying to fit in, trying to please, trying to conform. And then bad things will happen to us. And somehow we survive them. And we look back with our 20/20 hindsight vision and we say, I knew that was going to happen, or I felt like something was wrong. But for some reason, at the decision point, we didn't trust our feelings. Sometimes we couldn't even tell you what we were feeling. We get so scrambled up. So how can we get ourselves back to that joy that we came into this world with and then hang on to it? One way is you need to own your crazy. We all have our little idiosyncrasies, those things that drove other people crazy, often from a very young age, that we learned to stop doing because we didn't like the feedback that we were getting. Somehow it didn't conform. But we also all know someone who's a bit odd or eccentric. Perhaps it's an uncle who just loves to go to the curb to get the newspaper in his underwear. And you or I would be mortified to be seen on the street in our underwear, but old Uncle Charlie, he doesn't give a rip what anybody thinks. He could care less that you or I wouldn't want to be seen in our underwear. So eventually, we all just start to say, that's Uncle Charlie. The thing is we accept Uncle Charlie and what he does because Uncle Charlie accepts it in himself. We're all a little crazy by somebody's standards. We're all just too busy hiding it from each other. So the problem is that if we reject the crazy in us, it's an open invitation for everyone else to reject that aspect of us. I mean, how on earth can we expect other people to accept the things that we're not even willing to accept in ourselves? And sometimes our gifts are hidden inside our crazy. I personally wish that life could be more like a Broadway musical, that occasionally we could just burst into song. But in my entire corporate career, I only allowed myself one time to keep a colleague waiting while I finished an entire chorus of I Want a Hippopotamus for Christmas before I would give her my full attention. And amazingly, she still talks to me to this day. So in addition to owning our crazy, we need to own our gifts. In addition to coming into this world as a miracle, we come here with gifts and talents. Maybe we're intelligent or artistic, or we could be musical or have a fantastic voice. It might be that our greatest strength is that we're empathetic and we're a fabulous listener. Or we might be differently gifted. Because even those people who come into this world with the label of somehow being defective have something tremendous to share. Too often, we reject or ignore those aspects of ourselves that make us truly unique. We keep ourselves small for fear that we'll be judged, that even if we think we're really good at something, we listen to the judgments of others that say, we'll never be good enough. And even if those voices aren't coming from outside of us, we have our own internal voices that tell us the same. We might also fear that we're going to be misunderstood. We'll look at family members and friends and fear jealousy or resentment. Or we might be waiting for validation. And if we're not in the right environment, that validation may never come. Ironically, we're a celebrities-obsessed society. We admire and revere the people who were inspired enough to own their gifts and then truly stand out. Because those people understood that even if they didn't fit in where they were right now, if they fully owned their gifts, they would risk short-term isolation, because eventually they would attract the people who would celebrate their celebrity. The world would be a really sad place if we all kept ourselves as small as most of us do. Bruce Springsteen was told over and over again that he should just stick to writing music because no one would want to hear a voice like his. Sylvester Stallone resorted to writing his own movie, Rocky, so that he could insist on the starring role, because he'd been told over and over again he was no leading man. Rather than listening to his critics, Andy Warhol redefined art for an entire generation. I could go on and on with examples. The problem is, the irony is, we keep ourselves small, and then we complain that we're small. We argue for our limitations, and then we get them, and then we complain that we're a miracle. Or we complain, that we're limited because we forget that we're a miracle. In the corporate world, I regularly had talented people who would come to me and express ambition. And so I would say to them, tell me what you want to achieve and I will help you map it out. Sadly, only about 1% of those people ever followed through. They wouldn't read the books, they wouldn't go to the classes, they wouldn't take the training or the seminars, and they would lie to themselves and say, I was too busy or I couldn't make it work with my other obligations. Personally, I think what held them back was fear. The problem is, not fully owning your gifts and following your dreams gives you a permission slip to someday look back and say, I could have made it, but I chose not to. The problem is, the permission slip comes with a high price, the price of regret. Regret that you didn't own your gifts and that you forgot that you were a miracle. And in order to fully own your gifts, you need to own your power. As a manager and leader of people for much of my career, I always felt like a key component of my job was playing diplomat between employees, and that's putting it nicely. On a pretty regular basis, I would have someone come into my office and say something like this: Jennifer took over the whole meeting and no one else could get their ideas heard. To which I would usually reply something like this: I'm always at a loss for what I'm supposed to say to someone like Jennifer when people come to complain about them. Should I say, Jennifer, stop being so strong. You're intimidating the weak people. The response was usually shock and silence. So I would fill the silence by saying, if Jennifer took over the whole meeting, it's because you all let her. We can call her in here, and I can help you walk through it, but you need to go take your power back. Too often we actually put ourselves in a position of powerlessness and we don't even realize that we've done it. When I was young and starting off in the corporate world, I was very intimidated by the people who were high up on the ladder. I allowed myself to feel small around people that I perceived to be arrogant. As I started to climb the ladder, I started to realize that those people were no better than me. Oh, sure, they might have had a degree in engineering or something that I didn't have, another skill, but I also realized that I had skills and talents that they didn't have. So in reality, they were no more special than me, just special in a different way. So I finally discovered if I was going to move ahead, I had to learn to own my power. I remember a very senior director in a company who was a former Marine. He was very tall, and he had a commanding presence. He had a bad habit, when he was angry, of crowding your personal space while screaming at you, as though standing over you in an imposing way was somehow going to drive his point home better. One day, when I was the recipient of his screaming, I decided to fight back. So rather than trying to step back from this imposing gentleman, I actually took a step closer, and I pointed my finger up in his face as I made my counter-arguments. Inside, I was terrified. But ironically, from that day forward, he never publicly yelled at me again. From then on, we had a relationship of mutual respect. Using that situation to own my power set the stage for me to own my power, at least at work, from that day forward. Because on that day, I remembered that I was a miracle, and I learned that you need to own your boundaries. Because if you don't, no one else will. And sometimes it's physical boundaries, but more importantly, it's emotional boundaries. I tend to be a giver. I think I learned that from my mother. Twice in my life, I have given away so much of myself that I nearly lost everything, including my health and sanity. When we love someone, we want to do everything we can to help that person, to try to make that person happy. So we give and give and give of ourselves until we finally wake up one day and realize you can't make someone else happy, because what makes each one of us happy changes over time. So if you multiply the number of people you're trying to make happy by the number of times what makes them happy will change, the math is just impossible. We have to learn to listen to our feelings, respect our boundaries, and not be afraid to say no. We all know that feeling when someone asks something of us and we get that twinge, that thing that says, I don't really want to do that. But we do it anyway, either out of a sense of obligation or because we feel that we owe the person asking some type of rational explanation for why we don't want to do it. And the only reason we can think of is it just doesn't feel right. So we go ahead and give a piece of ourselves anyway. And then we either let that person down in some way because our heart really wasn't in it, or we let ourselves down because we gave away a piece of ourselves that we really didn't want to give. And either way, we end up feeling resentful instead of just owning our boundaries in the first place. Finally, I'd like to ask you to do one more thing, and that's own your rebel child. I was the rebel child, the youngest of three. In retrospect, I'm amazed that I made it to my 16th birthday without my parents killing me. Telling me no was an open invitation for me to do exactly what you didn't want me to do. Somewhere along the line, I think I hid my rebel child away, but I think we all have a rebel child that's just in there dying to get out. As I look back at my life, some of my grandest adventures and biggest learning experiences came from being that rebel child. When I was in early grade school, we lived in a development that had a golf course in the center of it, and my brother and I had to walk to school and back every day. We were given explicit instructions to never walk through that golf course. So of course we did, every day. Now, if we had followed orders, we would have missed out on the wonder of watching tadpoles turn into frogs in a stream on that golf course. Every day we would rush there after school to watch their progress of growing legs and going from swimming creatures to hopping ones, and then trying to catch and hold them as though we were somehow surrogate parents because we'd been so actively involved in their development. The reality is being the rebel child can come with some amazing rewards. Our lives are actually filled with wonders and miracles, and we just need to remember that we are one of those miracles. I'll finish here today by asking you to do one thing every day, and that's look in the mirror and remind yourself, I am a miracle, a blessing, and a treasure. Thank you.